You are listening to Bob and Everett on the Jesus Discussion. Now, you may have noticed that we're not trying to sell ourselves to you based on some fancy curriculum vitae, CV, resume, list of accomplishments, publications, or degrees, even though we might be able to. And this is because we're not trying to sell ourselves to you, but instead to have a reasonable discussion, one that empowers you, the listener, to think for yourself and investigate what we claim. If you find that you want to discuss a certain point, challenge some information, or explore a certain claim from this podcast, head over to soundcloud.com, The Jesus Discussion. That's soundcloud.com, The Jesus Discussion, and leave your comment. Or you can go to gab.com and find the Jesus Discussion profile or the Gab group, The Jesus Discussion, and begin a dialogue with us. Our aim in discussion is to fully understand each other and then work to further investigate these ancient writings together. Thanks again for listening. Now let's continue with the ancient writing of Mark. Welcome back to the Jesus Discussion. We last left off with verse 20 in chapter 1 as we go through Mark. And so we have this opening title that we've mentioned in every podcast so far, really the significance and almost this opening sentence of Mark, as you've pointed out, Everett, works as a title for all of Mark. The beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, or Jesus the Messiah, or Anointed One, King, the Son of God. Not a Son of God, but the Son of God, and how stark that statement is. And so everything that follows kind of fits under that heading as we follow through Mark, that this is the thing that Mark is trying to fill in with detail. We've talked about how Mark is moving pretty quickly through things. The kaiuthos, or immediately phrase, is just all over the place in Mark. It's every other word, not literally, but it's in there.
It's in there a lot.
And so we started with that statement, and then Mark took us back to this quote from Isaiah, and then we moved on to talk about John, who is not John who wrote the gospel, or the good news of John, or the good news according to John. He wrote, it is the John the Baptizer, or John the Baptist, and how he prepared the way. He baptized Jesus as this ceremonial kind of act, and we've got that kind of implied moment of the Trinity there, where the Father says, "This is my Son, on whom my favor rests," and the Spirit descends on him like a dove. And then he goes out into the wilderness for what Mark might use the phrase testing or challenge. And we talked about Romulus and is it Romulus and Remus, Everett?
Right. The mythical founders of Rome.
Right. When Mark has Jesus out there with the wild beasts and somehow surviving and overcoming that circumstance, it's not that he didn't do that, but Mark thinks to tell the audience about that because he's trying to connect with his audience, which is likely a Roman audience. Mm-hmm. If you're a vegetarian, and I did a bunch of things yesterday, and I'm telling you about my day, and one of the things I did was go hunting and, kill an animal and bring it back, I might skip that because that's not relevant to you. I might not tell you about that. If I'm growing a garden and I watered my garden that morning, I might tell you that because that connects. It doesn't change what happens, but we all do this. When we speak, we don't tell everyone everything. Well, not all of us. Sometimes I do, but we don't tell everyone everything. We tell people the things that connect with where we're going. And so that's what Mark's doing. It doesn't change what Jesus actually did. It's just, this is the thing. These are the things that Mark is bringing to the forefront, that Mark wants us to know. So he's highlighting things that connect with this Roman culture. Correct. So he goes out into the wilderness, he's tested, he comes back, and John gets taken away, and they don't really tell you what's going on. It's like, well, wait, where did John get taken away? What happened to John? And the early audience would lean in at that point. Oh my gosh, John's taken away. Was that a good thing? I don't think that was a good thing. And Jesus picks up where John left off and says, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. So repent or change your mind and believe in the good news. And then he goes on to call these average fishermen, from mending their nets to join in for his cohort or his group, that these are going to be the people that he builds this kingdom on. We've seen him anointed. He's the Son of God. The reader is looking at what he's doing, and these are the first people he goes and gets, fishermen.
And building a movement that would change the world with people who were in terms of their social or socioeconomic status, was not that great.
Yeah.
So it sets the stage for everything what Jesus do, starting with the foundation of just working with common, ordinary people and finding that they did remarkable things because of the power of God.
Yeah, and later we'll see that. So all of this stuff is pretty, from the opening statement being just a huge controversial statement in this era. And you can go back and listen to our first episode if you want to get a little deeper into that. But this opening statement is such a huge thing, and then he builds his kingdom on these average people. And now he's got some followers, and then right away then in verse 20, because this Roman audience, as you said in our last episode, this Roman audience is kind of like, in some ways, is a little bit like our American, modern first world audience. It's like, we just want to
short
see...
attention.
Yeah.
Short attention span.
Cut to the action, cut to the action, cut to the action.
Yeah. Okay, what's next?
What's next? And so, a lot of these immediatelys in Mark, I've said before, read a lot like cuts in a film.
That's a good way of putting it, yeah.
And so there's stuff that happened in between the cut, but they don't need to show you how he drove home and walked into his house. They'll just show you walk out and get into his car, and then they'll cut with him walking in the front door from inside the house. And they don't need to show you the whole drive.
Gee, I didn't know Jesus had a car.
Yeah, right?
but you illustrate your point, though. Mark says now in verse 14, says that John was taken into custody. But he doesn't give us that whole story about the birthday party and the beheading, and he doesn't give us all that. He just says he was taken into custody. And last Sunday I had somebody ask me a question. It says, why does he leave stuff like that out? And the answer is that it doesn't serve his purpose. He's going someplace with this narrative. And that what happens to John is not a part of, he's trying to show that John was the forerunner, but he's not the guy, that Jesus is what it's all about. And so we transition from John the Baptist to the ministry or the teaching and the deeds of Jesus.
Yeah. And in good storytelling fashion, you don't just answer all the questions right away. You leave your audience going, well, what happened to him? And if you want someone to read something, you don't write it in a boring way. So, you don't just give all the details in a linear fashion like you're in court on the stand testifying. That's not how these documents were written, because an ancient agrarian society is going to find that really boring, and an ancient Roman society is going to find that really boring.
Especially a Roman.
Right. Yeah. And if you read ancient Roman plays, you can go back and look at those plays, and you can see how quickly they move through things. And those plays have been out there. They're translated more into kind of 15 to 1700s ish style English, but you can still find translated copies of them online to read for free, and get a sense of how.
I've never figured that out. Never figured that out. How come ancient Romans always have a British accent?
Right? And they use thee and thou. But that brings up another point that we've said before, Everett, about the language. We're reading an ancient Greek language. Now, Romans,
right?
Their language was Latin, correct?
Officially, yeah.
Officially. But
in practical, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, in practical terms, Greek was the language of the entire Roman world. And even when Romans were talking to Romans, many times they would use Greek, because it was, there's an old saying that the Romans conquered the Greek Empire, but the Greek culture conquered Rome. And that's really true. So that no matter where you lived in the Roman Empire, most likely you spoke at least two languages, and that was your local language and Greek. So it makes sense, if you wanted to communicate to a large audience, that you wouldn't write something in Latin, but you'd write it in Greek.
Right. So if you want the message to spread beyond your culture, you would write it in a language that was common to all of the cultures.
Right.
And that was really the thing with Rome too, is they didn't want to kill everyone on the planet. They wanted to rule everyone on the planet.
Right.
And so they were just as happy to assimilate your religion, your gods, your deity. And that's a little bit of where the offense comes in with this narrative about Jesus. Wait, you're saying there's another king and he's God?
Correct. The Romans wanted peace and tax money. And if whatever you were doing would guarantee that you would be peaceable and you would pay your taxes, in other words, be loyal to Rome, everything was going to be okay. But the minute you challenged one of those two things, that you were stirring up a rebellion against Roman authority, you're causing trouble, or you're telling people not to pay their taxes, and all of that is going to become important as Jesus' enemies confront him later in the narrative. But the minute you do that, now you've run afoul of the Roman authorities, and they know how to deal with you.
Yeah. There's an example of this from a non-Jewish Christian culture when Paul goes to Ephesus, in Acts, and they're running him out. The mayor of the area says, whoa, we've got a lynch mob here. We've got an unlawful, and he uses the Greek word ekklesia, which is the word that often gets translated into church, but just means assembly or congregation. Right? We've got an unlawful assembly here, and Rome is going to come get us, because that's the other way that you can really run afoul of Rome, is exercising authority they didn't give you to exercise, which is just the same as undermining. They're no longer in charge, So he doesn't want, and they will wipe out your entire town. And so you will cease to exist.
They wanted peace and they wanted tax money. But if you challenge them or you cause trouble that would upset that, then they'll put you out of business permanently. And the Romans were not looking to kill people, but they had no problem killing people.
Right. And, for a couple of reasons. One, make an example.
Right.
Two, you gain notoriety in the Roman Empire through conquering.
Yes.
I mean, that's how Julius Caesar, came to power, is because he was a conqueror.
Exactly.
And so that's some of the internal politics of Rome is people were threatened within Rome if they had power and someone else was out conquering. And that's actually how, Vespasian came to power, through being a conqueror.
Yes. And, we talked about the Romans like to make examples. The rebellion of Spartacus, a slave rebellion against the Roman Empire, ultimately failed, and the Romans crucified 3,000 slaves and put their crosses on the road from the port city to Rome, so that everybody coming into the Roman capital would see this is how Rome deals with rebellion. So you better be careful.
Right. So you're not just talking about, well, maybe I'm willing to sacrifice my life for my ideals. It's, am I willing to sacrifice everyone else around me for my ideals?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So this is a huge deal. All right. So we move on. We've got some Roman history, and this is a lot why that opening statement is such a shocker. And you really can't understate what a shocker that opening statement is. So we've gathered these first few followers here with Jesus. And the first thing they do, or the immediately, which is not necessarily the first thing they do, but the and then that Mark wants to tell us about. And here we're going to pick up actually in verse 21. I may have said verse 20 earlier in the podcast. I meant verse 21. So they went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath he entered the synagogue and began to teach. They were amazed at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one having authority, not as the scribes. Now, do we want to take that first little bit? Now, this is not, you would say that the flow of thought that Mark is saying actually ends a few verses later, but I know there's a few things in here that might be new to some people, so maybe we just want to take these two verses real quick.
Sure. I think it's significant that Jesus enters the synagogue, which was the local Jewish worship houses. Being a good Jew, he goes there on the Sabbath, and he teaches because frequently they allowed people to offer, some teaching, some word. And so Jesus begins to teach in the synagogue. And the interesting part of that is that the crowd was amazed at his teaching because he taught with authority. Now, in our society, we're used to that. You go into a college classroom or you go into even church, and somebody just starts teaching as, this is the way it is. But the way the scribes taught is that they would look at a passage from the Bible and they would say, well, now, what does this mean? Well, Rabbi so-and-so says it means this, but Rabbi so-and-so says this. So they would kind of filter through all these ribbons of different ideas of what that meant. And so that's kind of what the people were used to. But Jesus comes in and teaches with authority, and it shocks people. They're amazed at his teaching.
Right. And so to differentiate, because we talk about scribes and we talk about teachers, and there's other words used for other groups and factions and sub-factions, and sometimes that's just a broad term. But typically a scribe was someone who was also going to make copies of these ancient writings.
They were the scribes. But they were also, to be called a scribe, there was more than, you'd had to have more than good penmanship. You were considered an expert on what we would call the Old Testament, or what the Jews called the Scriptures, or the Torah, the Tanakh, and so that was your field of expertise. And the scribes, along with some of these other groups that we'll talk about later, ultimately Jesus runs afoul of them, and many of them become his enemies. And it starts here, where Jesus teaches with authority, not as the scribes taught.
Yeah, you might also, we have within the Christian culture and within other faiths, there are people who write maybe commentaries on the old documents, high scholarly commentaries. They might be people who were considered maybe of that level of scholarship.
Yes, they were the experts.
Right. We're the ones that everyone refers to, and then they have this way of teaching where they're bringing up what other people have said and not really boldly going out and saying, this is what it means. And Jesus comes in and says, yeah, this is what this means.
Right.
And it shocks them, amazes them, and it's the beginning of kind of some tension between them.
Right.
And so that's not really the full flow of thought. If we're breaking down Mark into flows of thought, that's the beginning of this flow of thought that's going to end a few verses later. So to continue on at verse 23, just then there was a man in their synagogue with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, saying, "What business do we have with each other, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." And Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be quiet and come out of him." Throwing him into convulsions, the unclean spirit cried out with a loud voice and came out of him. They were all amazed, so that they debated among themselves, saying, "What is this? A new teaching with authority? He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." Immediately, the news about him spread everywhere into the surrounding district of Galilee.
Okay, so question number one is, how many times does Mark use the word immediately?
Right?
Yeah, but go ahead. I'm sorry, I interrupted.
No, but you're right. I mean, it's just, was it like 3 times in there or something?
Yeah.
It was a few times. So not only is his teaching shocking, but then he does this miracle. And so from the narrative standpoint, he sets up people who are like, oh, that's a little bit, you're coming in just telling us what it means. That's not the norm. And that's a little bit shocking. But then he backs it up by doing something shocking and miraculous.
Right. He amazes them at least twice in this one paragraph.
Mm-hmm. And there's this, in verse 25, there's a pretty significant little bit that we see. And the writers of these 4 different Gospels can use this a little bit differently depending on the part of the story they're trying to highlight.
Right. Bob, could I get you? Could we just back up a little bit?
Yeah.
And talk about the unclean spirit.
Mm-hmm.
That this is a euphemistic way of talking about something that we commonly refer to as demon possession.
Right.
That this man has been taken over by this spiritual being that Mark identifies as unclean. Well, that would not be a spirit from God, or he would not be unclean. So this is a euphemistic way of talking about that the man was demon possessed, which is a theme that Mark will develop more as we go through the book.
Yeah.
But notice,
well,
go ahead.
Just exactly what you were saying. A lot of people go back and they want to reinterpret what is being said. There are times when Mark talks about people who are simply sick or have mental trouble.
Mm-hmm.
And there are times where he says this person is possessed by a demon. And he's not an idiot. You know.
Well, yeah. We always assume that we are so smart and sophisticated in our time. These poor, simple people, they didn't understand. That's just not true. People back then were just as smart as people today. The human ability to know things hasn't changed. Mm-hmm. We know more things. We know different things today. We have a depth of knowledge about stuff. But that doesn't mean that these poor, stupid people didn't know what epilepsy was, or they didn't know when someone was dead. Mm-hmm. Of course they did.
And they knew the difference between someone who's got a mental issue and someone who's possessed by an evil spirit. And, you know, I would even argue that with our cultures, Everett, like each society reflects a depth of knowledge about the things that society cares about.
Right.
So, you know, we invest in things, you know, there were cultures that were just amazing builders, and we look back on them and go, how did they do that?
Yeah.
They had an interest in doing that. Mm-hmm. And so they were not unintelligent. And verse 24 actually conveys that Mark, you know, what Mark is saying, because the response is, what business do we have with each other, Jesus of Nazareth? Mm-hmm. Have you come to destroy us? I know you are the Holy One of God. Who you are, the Holy One of God. Now, Jesus, I already know who you are. Have you come to destroy us? That's consistent with Mark's initial assertion. This is the Son of God. Mm-hmm. If this is just a person with a mental disorder, why are they saying that?
Right. And you could say, well, that's part of his mental disorder. But wait, why did Mark tell the story and include it here? And why? That's part of understanding the narrative. That clearly Mark is saying that the man had an unclean spirit. He's not saying, gee, this guy was, you know, a couple of fries short of a Happy Meal. He's demon possessed. And Jesus rebukes not the man, but the spirit, saying, be quiet and come out of him. So Jesus knew what was going on, and the unclean spirit knew what was going on.
Yeah. And this goes back to say that these people didn't know what was going on. Also, just it busts up the narrative flow of what's happening in terms of like, you know, it doesn't, for that to be the case, then it makes the author, Mark, out to be someone who's just dumbfounded even by his own writing. He's just like, I don't even know all this. Look at all this. I'm just going to put a bunch of stuff down and look at all this spiritual stuff. And wow. And there were authors of things, of writings circa this era, of people who were just having visions and writing stuff. And the stuff, you know, it wasn't as lasting.
No,
know?
Where's the theme? Where's the point? Where does this take us? What's the implication of it? See, as you read Mark, you read through there, and you may look at it and say, "Well, now," but you understand what Mark is saying. Mm-hmm. So you
Right.
you can choose to believe it or not believe it, but there's no confusion about what Mark is saying here.
That's a great point, and that's really it. Is that I have friends who don't believe what these documents say. I do believe what these documents claim, but where we sometimes reach an impasse is when they try and tell me that the document doesn't say what it actually says. So I have no problem with you not
You and
believing
I
it.
must you and I must have some of the same friends.
I know and I think it's a pretty common theme, and that's really my only concern is, listen, hey, if you want to string me up for what I believe, that's something but don't string me up for what I don't believe, so
Yeah.
at least come around to
Yeah,
understand what my assertion is here.
Right.
So this is a pretty interesting thing, and Everett, I'm just nonlinear. I was actually going to go back on those, starting from
sorry.
verse 25. No, that's totally okay, because it's probably
I'm the
better
linear
for
one.
I know. Well, it's probably a good thing, because I think it's probably better people go through that linearly than non-linearly. Otherwise, I could be a little bit hard to follow like that. Okay, but then we have this phrase that keeps coming up: "Be quiet and come out of him."
Yes.
Well, why is Jesus silencing a demon? What would be the deal? Wouldn't you want, hey, let's announce it, right?
Let's get a crowd. Let's put up a tent. Maybe we can go on TV.
Right?
Why would he do this? And I don't want to take away what you were going to say. But this is something that's called the Messianic Secret. And Jesus does this over and over and over throughout Mark's gospel. And he's making it clear, and Mark is making it clear, that Jesus is not a con man. He's not trying to gather a movement in order to gather a movement, that he is on a mission from God. And he's saying to this unclean spirit, you be quiet about this, because first of all, I'm not ready for that to be revealed. But more importantly, I think, why is Mark saying this? Because he wants everybody to know that Jesus is not a charlatan. He's not putting on a medicine show here, but that he's the real deal.
Right.
Otherwise, why would he do it?
There's also the inevitable conclusion that when this all comes out and people realize who Jesus says he is and what type of kingdom he is announcing, it leads to his death. So that kind of looms a little bit as well. And I think too, from as you're reading it, if you're a Roman, you're reading in, you're like, well, wait, why did he want to keep that secret? And you ask a little bit as well.
Right.
And you kind of reason through some of that.
Right.
Now, Everett, do you want to take anything about the Holy One of God?
Well, I think it refers back to the role of, or the image of the Messiah, that he's the anointed one. He is the representative of God that would usher in the kingdom. That you are the Holy One of God.
And that phrase hagios there is the Greek word,
Right.
that's being used for the common Greek person. When they heard that something was hagios, they would.
Yeah, it means a setting apart, and that you are the one that God has set apart. And notice, he's not saying you are a holy person. You are a set apart guy that, to use the some modern parlance, he's not just an anointed guy, but that he occupies a unique position. He is the Holy One of God. He is the one that God has set apart for this mission.
Right. And that ties back to, he is the Son of God.
Mark 1:1. Yep.
Right. And so here he's not trying to announce and get a big show. He's not trying to fill people's Twitter feed or something like that. in our culture, we think, well, if where's the proof? But I think another element of this is that one of the kind of sub themes of Mark that he keeps bringing up is the issue of faith. So earlier we read in just the last episode, the idea of believe. Mm-hmm. Repent and believe the good news. And believe is to put your faith in something. And so
put your trust.
Your trust, right?
Exactly.
And so if this is the Son of God, then isn't he powerful enough just to say, here I am, and that's the way it is, and no one has a choice?
Right.
But there's this idea that he didn't come in that sense. And so this idea of faith and what it means to believe and the human choice, which I know gets into complications about philosophical and theological concepts of God that we might want to maybe later sometime take an episode and walk through. But,
yeah, maybe later.
but still, from our perspective, just to speak from the human perspective, that we get up every day and we have choices to make. That here God is coming and his desire is for faith. Mm-hmm. So I think that's. Would you say that that's also kind of one of the threads that Mark wants to weave along with this good news?
Yeah, he's directing. He's truly directing people to place their trust in God. One of the things that Ralph P. Martin, in one of his commentaries on Mark, points out is that during this period of time, there were a lot of showmen that went around, not unlike today, and they didn't have TV. Obviously, I was making a joke earlier, but they basically did some of the things, and I'm not criticizing everyone who's on TV, by the way, but they basically did some of the things that some showmen do, and that is, hey, I'm somebody special. Look at how great I am. Make sure that you put a lot of money in the hat, and we think that's kind of a modern or a contemporary phenomenon. It's not. There were people going around in this time that were doing that. And clearly Mark separates Jesus from those religious hucksters and says, wait a minute, something different is going on here. He is directing people to have faith in God, not in the showman.
Right. He's not trying to puff up his own notoriety.
Right.
This is a really interesting section, and this section actually kind of flows into a series of a few of the same type of story.
Right.
That happen. 2 or 3 of these, and Mark will do this. So as you're doing, we mentioned in the last episode and the last few episodes, at the end of every episode, do what we call a pre-read. So just set a timer. Mm-hmm. And take 15 or 20 minutes and try and read the 16 chapters of Mark and just get through it as quick as you can. And you won't be able to read every sentence in perfect detail, but don't stop and pull out a commentary and go, what is this? Just make yourself familiar with how the words flow through the document so that when you go back into the details, you know what details are coming after. You have a sense of where the story is going. Mm-hmm. And you'll find that there are these sections where 2 or 3 of the same type of story are being told, and they're all kind of highlighting the same type of thing, and they're speaking to a greater truth.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. So I can either tell you a greater truth and I can spell out a theological statement, or maybe what I want to do is tell a few different stories that infer and imply, so that as you consider those stories, you don't just have something didactic or dry statement or axiomatic that I've told you. Now you've got a few narratives to help imply what the greater truth is for your consideration.
Right.
All right. So continue the pre-read. Is there anything else that we need to comment on this section?
No, I think, as we go, we'll keep referring back to these early statements of Mark and the early deeds of Jesus, because Mark is very thematic. And you may not catch that if you just read through once, but as you begin to read more and more and become more and more familiar with it, you begin to see that Mark is going someplace. He starts his gospel or his story with the declaration that Jesus is the Son of God. And when he dies, the Roman soldier says, truly, this was God's Son. So there are these themes that Mark pursues through this, and that's why you're talking about the pre-read, but reading it over and over will give you a sense of how as you put it, how each little section fits into this overall theme that Mark is taking us through.
Right. I don't know if this will if this will sell me out, but I'm a nerd. I like the Harry Potter series. I've read those, and I appreciate her writing style. But there's a lot of little stories and little things, and when you read through one of the books, each of the little stories and little things adds up to her whole narrative. And that's true not just with that series, but any other series or any other well-written book. You've got a bunch of little moments and little bits, and they add up to the whole narrative, and it pulls you through. And Mark is a really good writer for his time. He's writing a really compelling, very interesting story,
right,
and controversial story for his era.
Yes, absolutely.
All right. Well, we thank you for tuning in, and we look forward to catching up with you next time. Again, if you have questions or comments and you want us to dig a little deeper into this or that, just go ahead and leave those comments on the post on the site. And thank you for tuning in. You have just been listening to The Jesus Discussion. You can subscribe to The Jesus Discussion at soundcloud.com, The Jesus Discussion, or on Podbean at thejesusdiscussion.podbean.com. You can find all of the ways to catch up on The Jesus Discussion at thejesusdiscussion.com. Thank you again for listening, and we hope that your day is truly a great one.